Okay, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. We're delighted you've joined us for our fourth webinar this year, the Ethics Organization and Society Research Cluster at JCU Singapore Business School. We're very delighted to be joined by Professor Collins Ntim, who has joined us from the University of Southampton Business School in the UK. Collins Ntim is a very good friend of mine. He's Professor of Accounting at the Center for Research in Accounting, Accountability and Governance, the Department of Accounting at the University of Southampton, UK. I was previously the head of Department of Accounting. He's also served as the Associate Dean for Education, and until quite recently, he was the Deputy Head of School for Research and Enterprise. Collins has published quite extensively in the fields of accounting, finance, business and management, and is focused mainly around areas of governance and development research as well. His work has generated significant research income, is heavily cited, one of the most cited corporate governance authors, and also his work enjoys a lot of traction, not just from the academia, but also from policymakers and the media. Collins has recently embarked on a very important assignment. He was the Unit of Assessment 17, sub-panel member for the 2021 UK Research Excellence Framework, which is the body that examines and, if you like, rates the research of all UK universities. Is served in that important body. So we're very, very delighted to welcome you, Collins. We know you're very busy, and we want to thank you for agreeing to speak to us. So Collins, you have the floor for about 45 minutes. If you've got questions during the presentation, by all means, make use of the Q&A button, and we'll look at that, and Collins will kindly respond either during the presentation or afterwards in the next 45 minutes. So Collins, thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, and very grateful for the invitation. Thank you very much, Erica, who has been very nice in the background organizing this and interacting with us to make this possible. I'm just delighted to be obviously in the virtual way, but engaging with you. Obviously, and maybe we'd delighted one day to come there physically and visit you in Singapore. Now, today, I know it's evening time for you. Maybe the last thing you want to do is be in a boring accounting seminar. So I'll be pretty quick, and then we can maybe have a bit more discussion. I would like to have maybe present some stuff briefly. So I'm going to share my slide, if that's okay, and I will present for maybe 15 to maybe 25 minutes maximum, and then I'll stop, and then I'll stop on sharing, and we can have a bit of a discussion. So let me see. I think we've tried this before, so hopefully it should work nicely, and this shouldn't be. Let me project this. Okay, great. And let me move this a little bit aside so that everything can be a little bit. Sorry. And try to move this a little bit aside. Yeah, great. Okay, go back. So what I want to talk about is this is a paper. This paper, partly I'm kind of attached to it a little bit because the paper has let me honestly struggle a little bit in the peer review process. So I started this paper in 2016 or 2014, actually, to be fair, and then it's gone on in different shades, and I've presented in a number of places. I think, to be honest, Emmanuel has listened to this paper probably before, so it's not probably any news to him. But generally, I mean, we are all in higher education institutions. I think you are a higher education institution, so I guess you want to know a little bit more about that, perhaps as a bit of a interest to for your 30 minutes or so. But so essentially, this paper is essential about higher education institutions. We focus on the UK, partly because of the data access, but I think later on I'll talk about why also because UK is quite often at the forefront of reforms and higher education reforms around many other things, including this, which is non-financial reporting in non-profit organizations, and with particular focus on risk and management, regulations and disclosures. I think the title of the paper, to be fair, has changed a little bit. And also the paper is now making progress through the rounds in the peer review process at an accounting journal, and probably a bit more advanced now. So maybe hopeful, fingers crossed. Hopefully not you're not a reviewer, but if you're a reviewer, then be kind. The paper has changed a little bit more. So I've got a much bigger paper now here because of reviewers' comments and so on. I'm not sure the version I sent, or I even sent you any version at all, but that might have been a bit lighter, but now it's a bit much more bigger piece of work. Obviously, we've taken a lot of reviewers' comments on board, and that has helped it. We've also presented it at a couple of places and also got some feedback as well. So we are on the same journey. The paper is not been accepted yet, so welcome feedback as well. This paper, I've done it with my colleague, Muhammad Emagrahi, and Muhammad Emagrahi is at Swansea University Management School in the UK. And I kind of, to be fair, I've done quite a number of projects together with Muhammad in recent times. Now, what we're trying to do, I hope that the screen is not, impeded by the screen, but what we're trying to do is simple. We try to address two main questions in this paper. The first question, well, probably three main questions, but the one is inherent. So we want to know the level of disclosures in terms of non-financial reporting in higher education institutions annual reports. So here, higher education institutions include universities, but we do have, in the UK, it's a bit, you may have some, not all higher education institutions are universities. Some may be institutes and things like that, particularly the science ones, Institute of Cancer or Science, those kind of things. They may not necessarily be university in the sense that they may be very highly focused, but they are still higher education institutions and they receive funding and so on. And so that's a bigger, that umbrella is a little bit bigger than universities, if you want to put that way. So we look at that. We look at what is the level of disclosures in terms of risk, which is, we argue, is non-financial reporting. Some people will argue later on that, well, some aspect of it is financial, which we engage with the reviewers in that process, and we accept that. And then the second thing is, okay, the levels of disclosures. The question is, let me see. I'm not sure whether I'm frozen or not. So the level of disclosures. The question is, what drive these disclosures? What explains these disclosures? So if you pick my university, which is University of Southampton, and you pick Nottingham University, which is Emmanuel's University, what explain the differences that you might see in terms of differences in disclosures with respect to risk? And here we focus particularly on governance. And so our second really clear-cut question is, what drive the disclosures with particular reference to the quality of governance in the university? And when I talk about quality of governance, I'm really talking about what is widely known as a board structures, kind of the board, its composition, its independence, and things like that, the committees and things like that. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then one of the things that we do after that is, okay, so maybe that relationship may be positive. So in other words, university institutions, higher education institutions that are better governed might have maybe better, might maybe disclose better, and vice versa. But then what might, how might that relationship change, for example? And here I talk about the shared governance arrangement. The shared governance arrangement, just let me briefly explain that, is in higher education institutions, particularly in the UK or the Anglo-American tradition, would typically have three main bodies. One is the council. The council is the highest body. It's like the board of directors of a company. It will typically have, in the UK, it will have independent directors, independent people of business background and have been successful in business. They will be typically appointed as independent members of the council or the board. And then in Scotland, it's called a court and so on. There are different names depending upon where you are in the UK, Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland. But generally, council is the popular word, but which is equivalent to board. They essentially is the highest governance organ in the institution. In any institution, it will have also have student reps, union reps, and staff rep and things like that. Then you have the Senate. The Senate is typically academics formed by academic and senior academics like Emmanuel, and for somebody like me, although I've never been in the Senate, and things like that. And they are essentially in charge of the academic decisions, the curriculum, the research, and things like that. And that's the highest making body. The third body, probably highly important, is the vice chancellor and his team, or in the US they call it the president and his team. So the vice chancellor would typically have, there's a vice chancellor or the president of the institution. Then you have executive supporting him or her, like the deputy vice chancellors or the vice chancellor for research, education, or teaching and learning. You have the services, the professional services, like director of finance, director of human resource, and things like that. And they form another team. So you have three bodies. And the argument is that these three bodies, when they interact well, talking to each other well, each performing its functions well, will have implications for the performance of the institution, including disclosures. And so we argue that so that's our second question, which is that how can the senior management team moderate the link between the governance and governance quality and voluntary disclosures? And then essentially, in the next slide, what I'm going to tell you is that, so we look at what is the level of disclosure, what drive these disclosures, particularly with particular focus on governance, and then can this moderation relationship between the senior management team and the other bodies have an impact on the disclosures? And that's what we find is, well, in terms of the first question, really, we find that there are the levels of disclosures among higher education institutions in terms of risk disclosures are relatively low, particularly if you compare the sizes of the institutions that you have, higher education institutions. And in the UK, some of the institutions have the balance sheet over $1 billion, like Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, Manchester. These are huge institutions, Birmingham. And so, which are equivalent to some of the FTSE 100 listed firms, or even bigger. If you compare that, that's very low. But then there's some level of disclosure, which is improving over time. So that's the first question. The second question, we find absolutely clear evidence that in the better governed institutions, the quality of disclosures with respect to risk, which is obviously a non-financial reporting metric, is much better, and vice versa. And the second question is that we find that the combination, that interaction between the bodies that I talked about, the Senate, the shared governance model, Senate, the Council, and the Vice Chancellery team actually strengthens that positive relationship between risk disclosures and governance quality. And the question is, okay, so what? Who cares about this kind of boring stuff? Well, it's important. And it's important in terms of one, policy, because from a policy angle, quite often, certainly in the UK, there has been reforms, which I'll talk briefly about, on governance on one side, and on risk disclosures and reporting, non-financial reporting generally on the other side. These reforms have been pursued disjointedly, so they are not coordinated. And so, the different bodies have pursued this as well. The Committee of University Chairs pursue the governance reforms, while the Office of Student, it used to be called Higher Education Education Office pursues the risk reforms, and they don't talk to each other. And my argument is that pursuing this reform jointly, it's going to be critical. It's important. So so a joint pursuance of the reforms regarding respect to that is important, and it will be even much more powerful. Academically, I think we argue that we make a contribution here. Certainly, one of the early evidence in this whole space in higher education institutions as a non-profit organization, but also particularly the moderating aspect of it, it's certainly arguably new to the literature. So we in a sense, we extend the literature from the mainstream published listed profit-oriented literature into the non-profit sector with particular focus on higher education institutions, but also we show further that, we show kind of a more nuanced insight on that with special focus on the shared governance arrangement. Essentially, this is all that I want to talk about. Essentially, the seminar is over anyway. But of course, I would like to elaborate a little bit on these things. So the broader literature here is the non-financial reporting literature. So when I talk about non-financial reporting literature for corporate governance research or disclosures, corporate social responsibility, environment, social governance, and things like that, sustainable development goals, global reporting initiatives, and so on. I think in the more recent times, those of you who follow this kind of literature, you have seen the International Financial Reporting Standards setting up the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, and the concept of double materiality and double duality and so on. I'm not going to go into it quickly at this stage, all kind of kicking off, big time, and so on. But this has always been there. So there's a huge literature in this space, particularly in the profit-oriented settings. And this increasingly has been creeping into non-financial, non-profit-oriented institutions or charities, whichever you might call it, like higher education institutions. And so there is extensive reforms going on in this space. And behind this is the idea that new public management, those of you who knows a little bit, new public management, the idea that concepts and practices that have worked well in the private sector can be transported and might improve public sector practices. And so these things typically you see it in listed firms, multinationals, global, multinational corporations maintaining global operations and things like that. They have done it, for many years, but increasingly, public sector institutions or semi-quasi-public sector institutions like higher education institutions are beginning to copy that. So that's the kind of the backdrop to that. And the idea is that if they engage with that, they'll be better. This certainly has gone on, and I'll talk about that briefly later on. In the UK, I'm going to stop there. But although, and typically, while these reforms are going on, there's a lot of write-ups by colleagues, academics and so on, and policymakers. And these write-ups typically are normative or critical stuff. So they critique it, or they say why it's not good or why it's good. But you don't really get any evidence like what we provide here today to back it. Now, at the same time, there has been, I've got to admit, there has been some work going on in this space in higher education institutions that we focus on in particular. So there's a bit of work that's gone on very early on in the 90s. For example, Gray, his soul rest in peace, Jim Haslam, who's still around, and all of these people, for example, looking at accountability disclosures and generally in annual reports, and they tend to be very descriptive. So describing what they see, like the levels of disclosure and so on and so forth, like we also do here, but we move further on, as I said. But who cares? Okay, yeah, describing things, but what are the patterns? What can we learn from it? Not much from these studies. Maybe I'm a bit very critical, but nevertheless, I have to be critical in order to make progress with my research equally. There has been also some work. So these accountability studies are not necessarily about risk. They are general accountability stuff. And so I can explain a little bit because of time. I will not go into it too much. There has been a bit of work also around risk management and governance. But this is, again, as I said, largely in the profit or large profit kind of oriented institutions. There's a bit of literature, which I myself have contributed to that, although I don't cite myself here. But, Philip Lindsley, Philip Stripes, Abraham Cox, and all those people, they've quite made a lot of contribution. Khalid Husseini and some other people here, which I've not captured all of them, have made a lot of contribution in this space, including myself, I have to admit. So the question, I mean, in terms of higher education institutions, there's been a bit of work on governance and voluntary or accountability disclosures. Gordon did a bit of study in the US. I and my colleague Steven and Martin did a bit of work in the UK. We've not come across, obviously to date, any work looking at risk disclosures in particular. That kind of as part of our motivation for focusing on risk disclosures, which is kind of another aspect of non-financial reporting, which is uncovered, which is not covered yet by the literature, to the best of our literature set. Now, and so that's why we are looking at it. What is the role of governance? Can governance quality explain risk disclosures? But we just do not stop at the risk and governance disclosure link. But we also argued that I talked about the relationship between the shared governance model arrangement that I talked about, the Senate, the Council, which is the board, the Senate academic arm, and the Vice Chancellor, which is kind of the CEO and his or her team, if you think about it from a much more like kind of public sector, listed firm type corporation. The Senate is the odd one out, which is probably uniquely, higher education, unique to higher education institutions in the sense of the way it operates. And so we argued that a very good interaction among these three teams, as I've talked about previously, will lead to better outcomes. And one of the outcomes here is that we will expect institutions that have a smooth interaction among the three organs, having better outcomes, including the extent to which they disclose, they manage their risk and subsequently report it or disclose it. So that's the argument we're making here. And so by that, as I've said, we will expect if the senior management team, that interaction to either weaken or strengthen the relationship. Essentially, if in poorly managed institutions, you will see even a worse quality of reporting and disclosure, management and subsequent disclosure as well. Now, why we focus on the UK? A lot of reasons. And although, apologies for the abbreviations, most of these abbreviations are essentially ACT, and Further Education Act, Higher Education Act, and things like that. They are all acts. But these are the acts that drive reforms in the UK. So the education, briefly, education in the past, say in the 60s, in the 50s, was seen as a public good. And you went to university for the sake of, for knowledge, to acquire curiosity of knowledge and so on. It wasn't necessarily instrumental. In other words, you're not necessarily to go to university, come out and get a bit, some job, contribute to the economy, increase the GDP and all these economic metrics that kind of become the focus. And that's important because it meant that academics can just do what they are curious about and pursue things that was not necessarily, that are perhaps risky, that may not lead to anything. And they can still do it without necessarily being judged by what is the outcome of this, what is the key performance indicator of your activity. Now, all of these reforms from 1963 to 2019, which is the latest one, what is done is gradually move this concept of higher education institution or university from that ideal curious environment, searching for something environment, to something that is more economic oriented, very instrumental, metric oriented. So you go to school, you have to be able to find a job. and you have to be able to contribute to the economy and then expand. It's all about economic orientation, and that is the sense of all of this. Obviously, part of that is that then these institutions have to behave like economic organizations, like the listed corporations, multinational corporations. And so the practices that you see in them are being mimicked here. And one of it is the non-financial reporting that we focus on here, in particular, risk reporting. I mean, I'm not going to go into a lot of the details. So in the UK, not to bore you, in the UK, if you have to, if you're a student in the past, you went to school, you went to university, higher education for free. You enjoy your accommodation, you enjoy tuition free, you had a one-to-one tuition and so on. You have your tutor and all that kind of nice environment. No, over time, all these reforms has meant that UK education, universities, as a student, you have to borrow, and you have a loan, you have to pay, and there is obviously that part of it is the competition, competition among the institutions. So you compete for students, particularly quality students, and everything has become marketized, corporatized, But I don't want to go into it. I get a little bit moved by that, but because I feel it as well, and I believe it as well, so I feel I become very emotional about it. But in the UK, there is a lot of metrics. I mean, Emmanuel talked about the research excellence framework. So it's almost like a beauty contest. Every 6-7 years, we contest who is the best institution in the UK as a research institution in the UK. And it's all about the quality of the outputs you get, and so on. You can imagine Oxford, Cambridge, and all of them coming at top. But of course, some institutions also competing. So there's always, and there's a teaching one, QA, audit, all those abbreviations. I'm not going to go into it, but it's all about competition for things, competition for students, and so on. All mimicking the new concept of new public management and that kind of stuff that I talked about. Now, nevertheless, one of the things about all of this reform is that you need, if you're operating like a multinational corporation, a business, then the concept of sound financial management, good governance, sound risk management becomes very important. And that is part of the motivation for engaging in this study. And there is competition and all of that. Obviously, the risk of collapse goes up. I mean, in the paper, we make all these arguments and so on. I don't want to wait too much time, so I'll move on. But during the COVID time, even pre-COVID, there were a lot more institutions that were projected to collapse. And even during the COVID, there was a large number of institutions, UK institutions, that were projected to collapse. They did not collapse, but maybe, who knows, they may collapse later on. But generally, that is the extent to which it is. So managing risk, particularly financial risk management, is critical. And then obviously, subsequently, the extent to which you report it, it's important. There's been a bit of accounting reforms as well within that, which I'm not going to touch all of them because a bit detailed. I maybe put a lot of that. So generally, we will argue that this is a very natural setting in the UK to conduct this kind of study. On one hand, you have a lot of reforms going on, neoliberal reforms, financial reporting and non-financial reporting reforms, and governance reforms, all kind of nicely put together. Arguably, perhaps the best environment to do this, arguably, in the world. Now, we developed this. I think based on reviewer comments, we've changed the theoretical framework a little bit. It's not changed completely. We've changed it from this kind of general multi-theoretical framework to what we call neo-institutional theoretical framework, where we still draw on these theories of resource dependence, legitimacy, and stakeholder, but we kind of classify the theories into two. One that is more about legitimacy or legitimation, symbolic kind of type of things. Either institutions do this, higher education institutions do this in order to gain legitimacy, or on the resources side or on the efficiency side, which so basically legitimacy theory, for example, is on one side, and we put resource dependence and others on the other side, and say they might either do it for genuine attempt to improve and enhance their practices, manage risk well, manage financial resources well, and so on. So we kind of split into that way, and based on that, we argue that you expect a positive relationship between the quality of governance and risk disclosure, and then I think I probably I'll jump over this. I know that I have no. I think I've missed one. Probably one. The second hypothesis that maybe I think I'll probably explain it later on. So the second hypothesis is about I talked about the interaction. I think I'll probably move it around, and I think it's probably in the back. We look at the interaction between the two, and we expect that relationship, this positive relationship, to be strengthened. So we have a hypothesis number 2. Now I'll move on to the data. So we collect this data from annual reports, primarily, maybe 98% of our data come from annual reports of higher education institutions in the UK. About 2% of the data come from other sources like LinkedIn for profiles of people, maybe Wikipedia, for example, not the best sources, but I mean, some of these data are so difficult. The university websites themselves, and so on. We also collect a huge data from the Office of Student or HEIs website, which the Student Statistical Agency website as well. So it's 3 main sources. UK, you have around 170 higher education institutions. We get data on about 164, and the actual data we're looking for, we had about 117 of them. I think the data is a bit out of date. I have to raise my hand up, and I told you, I started this 2014. That's true. Started a long time ago. I think we started this work 2015, to be honest, and that tells you the trajectory of academic work. Can go on and go on and go on like this. We develop an index for our risk measure. The index, that's a risk disclosure index, RDI. It contains 127 items. We score these items 0 to 6. And so ranging from, you can score a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 672, right? 127 times 6, right? That's 672. The risk index consists of 3 main parts. One is the financial risk disclosures. We then have operational risk disclosure and strategic risk disclosure. There are 2 main types of risk: financial and non-financial risk disclosures. And then the non-financial risk disclosures are typically divided into 2: operational risk disclosures, which is kind of day-to-day operation, and the strategic risk disclosures are typically about systematic risk disclosures, which the higher education institution will not have control over. Our governance quality measure is a governance index containing 100 items. These items come from the Committee of University Chairs in the UK code. So the Committee of University Chairs are a committee of the university, all the universities have got their chairpersons, and they form a committee, and essentially they drive reforms around the governance. The risk disclosure framework is coming from the Office of Student. It's a new name. It used to be called Higher Education Institution Office, something like HEIs. It has a different name in the UK. If you don't know, you have 4 countries essentially: Northern Ireland, you have got Wales, Scotland, and England, and sometimes there are small differences, particularly between Scotland and the rest. Scotland tends to be slightly different. Other than that, England and Wales tend to be very similar, and Northern Ireland sometimes follow the kind of England and Wales pattern, but it could be slightly different. So council is called council in all the 3 countries, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, but it's called court in Scotland, for example. That's just a minor point. So we have that, and we also have our senior management team measures. Here we are looking at, say, the senior management team size, the number of meetings, the diversity of it, along the lines of gender and ethnicity, the governing board size, the independence, and so on. I have got a lot of abbreviations going on in the paper. They're more kind of fully explained. So our first model is model 1, which is we have a risk disclosure index. We want to see what explains it. We have a lot of metrics. Let me see, can I use any of the, no. Anyway, I'm not sure, but we have a lot of metrics, but the main metric we are interested in is this metric here, that's the governance quality metric. The rest are controls and so on. So this governance quality index, which I talked about, is 100. It contains 100 items here. Can it explain this index here? Okay. We also run individual regressions for that financial one, and we do another one for operational, and we do another one for strategic as well. So essentially, we do a sub ones as well. And so that's our first one. And our second regression that we attempted. Let me see. Have I? Let me. Okay, I think probably need to put the pen back. Yeah, put the pen back. Okay. Apologies. Let me see. Where did I pick the pen? Yeah, pick it from here. So put it back. Clear all drawings. Okay. Hopefully it can now allow me to go. Okay. Oh, okay. Now we can go now. Great. Sorry. Okay. So now we have I'm not sure what I think I've done something wrong. Okay. Yeah, we have our sample here now. So the sample is, it's about 164. You can see the different countries sample there. It's dominated by England, as you can imagine, always. And we end up with about 117. And I think this is a kind of our selection criteria. I'll kind of move on a little bit quickly from here, and later on ask me questions as you deem appropriate. Now, so we have, so this is kind of a summary descriptive starts. It kind of seeks to answer our first inherent question. It's not so clear, but what is the levels of disclosure? It's on average, the levels of disclosure is about 17.31%, which is about 17%. So if you think about it, that's about 130 items present out of the potential 762 that they could score. And so that is relatively low. Normally in a public listed firm type, you are looking at 40 to 50% kind of threshold, or sometimes even 60%. So relative to non-profit oriented institutions, it's low generally. Nonetheless, it's quite widespread. You see that the financial risk disclosures are a bit more compared to, say, operational risk disclosure, which is the lowest, and strategic risk disclosure is kind of somewhere in the middle. The governance quality index is a bit decent compared to the risk disclosures, around 40%, 40%, and ranging between minimum of 8% and 75%. We see differences between what is called post-92 and pre-92. Now, post-92 institutions are kind of a former polytechnics. I listed a lot of laws and acts. Those acts converted some of them into universities, which were polytechnics, technical institutions, and essentially turned into universities. So they're kind of different. They have different mission. They have different focus compared to the pre-92 institutions, which are normally research intensive, more kind of your traditional university type. And we look to see whether there are differences. Sometimes you see difference, sometimes we don't. Now, okay, this is just to kind of see the difference between the risk disclosures and the governance disclosures. Clearly, the governance disclosures are higher than the risk disclosure. But what is interesting is that both of them are on the up. They are all going up gradually. Obviously, we stop at 2014. We would expect that it would have been improved much better by now, even if currently, right, in terms of. So in terms of our first question, governance quality, what is the relationship between that? I mean, across the board, whichever metric we use, we find a positive relationship. And so, in other words, and that kind of drive our main finding of it, that the quality of the governance kind of explain the differences that we see in the levels of disclosures in terms of risk, or the quality of the disclosures in terms of risk. And it generally is positive. The better the governance, the more the highly positive it is. the financial one doesn't look so much convincing. We then look at our second question, which is about the shared arrangement. So what we do is we interact the shared arrangement, which is the shared arrangement. We interact all the governance metrics with the shared arrangement, with the governance quality measure. So we have the governance quality measure, which is here. Look at it. What you see is that you see a significant difference in terms of the coefficient for DKI, which is a little bit around 0.12 thereabout. And you see that it's about 0.18 or even 0.2. So you see a significant difference. When we interact the DQI with any of the moderating variables, like the governing board size, the executive team size, and some of the metric, diversity of it, and so on, we see a much better, stronger, even positive relationship, and supporting our idea that when the three teams work together well, it's even much better. It leads to better outcomes. And so essentially, that's our main kind of work that we do in this piece of work. We do a lot of different things. We run random effect, lag effect, GMM, and so on. We've done a lot of the different analysis, especially going through the peer review process that we've done over the last year and a half or so. And we did some sensitivities, but overall our core findings remain. I'm not reporting that. So I think I have already highlighted these things. We find a positive relationship between the quality of governance and risk. And we also have, we find evidence of a moderating relationship between senior management team and the governance risk disclosure relationship. We already talked about the implications, and obviously there are a lot of limitations of this. We start from 2009, which is where a lot of the reforms, particularly the market-wide reforms, started, and obviously not before that. Also, we end at 2014, which is a bit, what is the state now? Maybe 7 or 8 years after that, for example. Challenges of indigeneity has always been there. We try many ways of addressing them, but I don't think we can always eliminate completely. And there is, in terms of the governance variables, maybe a little bit limited, and it can be expanded. Part of it is our data set is also relatively limited as well. So there are challenges with this, and certainly it can be improved, certainly in the future, hopefully. Now, I think that's me done. Probably I'm talking more than maybe 30 minutes, more than a little more. Okay, so I'm ready for questions, answers, and then I'm happy to share, unless somebody wants to ask me. But if you want to ask me, I can always project again, and so that we can have a chat together. Yeah, thank you.
Emmanuel, I think you're
mute. Yeah.
Apologies. So I was saying thank you to you, Collins. Very in-depth, very rigorous work, and thanks for sharing insights from that work. JCU Singapore is a pretty different sort of university structure in terms of the ownership framework, but I think there's quite a lot that we can take in at JCU Singapore in that. So I've got a few questions. I'll go straight to the Q&A button. Can I just encourage colleagues to use the Q&A button to put your questions forward? So Professor Abhishek Bharti, who is one of the leaders at JCU Singapore, campus dean at JCU Singapore, has asked if, I've asked a question around scalability of your findings in different jurisdictions and culture. And maybe what would that mean? So in the UK, you've looked at a, generally speaking, public sector funded type education. Apart from, I don't know whether Buckingham University was in your sample.
Yes, in the sample.
So maybe there isn't a lot of public-private owned HEA structure in your framework. But what does it mean for a country like Singapore? What does it mean for other jurisdictions?
Thank you very much. I think you're right. I mean, the UK is largely 99.9%, public funded institutions. But I will say that there is a bit in this for institutions around the world and countries, especially where there's a lot of also significant activity by privately owned institutions. But the post-92 institutions, by their nature and incorporation, public corporate, are supposed to be corporations. So they're kind of essentially supposed to be operating like public, privately, profit-oriented institutions by their incorporation. So perhaps that's the closest you get to that private, and their mission, vision is supposed to be, contribute to the economy, generate surplus, and all of that kind of stuff that you might think about a private sector institution, or even in countries where there are significant mixed structures, as perhaps maybe in Singapore. Now, there's a lot to take out of it. So I just wanted to highlight that aspect of it, of the work, not just Buckingham or something like that. So there's a bit of that. I didn't say a lot about that. Now, there's a lot to take out of this. I think one of the things, for example, could be that you look at this from different governance structures on a global scale, right? So not just in certain individual countries. In terms of our recommendations, for example, we would like to see a cross-country large-scale study, because all institutions, whether private or owned or not, will have some of these core structures. It will have the team, the vice chancellor team or the president team. It will have a governing body or a council and so on. That will be there. It will have a senate or some sort of academic body. So that is not disputable. What might be different is the ownership structures, for example, or the national regulatory framework, or the orientation, Anglo-civil public, civil law origin or Anglo-American origin and things like that. And in a global study, you can bring out some of these teams and perhaps focus on those teams as as a potential drivers or the difference that you might see in the disclosures. So, for example, does ownership structure matter? For example, that could be a whole question that you look at. Does the if there is a kind of governance imperative in terms of diversity structures, so you have quota system, which might be a mandatory system, or you might have a voluntary system. Again, you can look at that kind of difference. So the work can be expanded significantly with, particularly with, having the big countries, China, India, USA, Canada, Russia, things like that in it. So absolutely, this is a tip of the iceberg in that sense. Thank you, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Collins. We've got a question from Argentan. How did you define the term NFR, not financial reporting? I think you got onto this in your presentation later on, but if you want to share a few more insights. Please.
Yeah. So I mean, so essentially, we define this as the non-financial reporting. Here we are focusing. I think I made a bit of reference to it, focusing on the narrative that go with the financial report, right? And the narrative obviously will have a team. It will be typically team focused. So the narrative with respect to corporate governance, the narrative with respect to corporate social responsibility. And I think that is maybe nowadays a bit of a general term now, but then that place alone has got a lot of teams there. The environment governance and social disclosures, some call it that way, some call it sustainable development goals disclosures, sustainability disclosures, and there's a huge bunch of things around that. Intellectual capital disclosures, human capital disclosures, and so on. Of course, Another one is risk disclosures. And that's the focus of this particular work as a risk disclosures, as a non-financial disclosures. Now, we have been asked, and reviewers have raised this question that, okay, although this is non-financial reporting, but the risk disclosures, there are some aspect of financial disclosures and that we raise our hand and say, yes, absolutely. But then to some extent, we focus largely on the narrative surrounding the disclosure. So if the company discloses about liquidity, exchange rate, interest rates, credit risk and default and so on, absolutely, they are financial in nature. But then the narrative surrounding that, what are they saying about it? Are they saying is it high risk, or they're going to collapse? So it's a narrative that surround even the financial disclosure that we focus on. And so so that's our focus in this particular case, non-financial disclosures with particular focus on risk disclosures, especially the operational side and the strategic risk side of reporting or disclosures. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Collins. If I may just ask a quick question about theory. So you talked about starting from a bit of an eclectic theoretical approach, then you sort of narrow down to neo-institutionalism.
Right.
But you still have some sort of legitimacy, efficiency, type of logics surrounding the risk management, as it were. But I'm just trying to, have you been able to pinpoint the institutionalism, in the paper? And is there, what's the contribution, theoretical contribution?
Yeah, I think a very good question, maybe a very challenging question to answer at the same time. So obviously this is part of the good thing about presenting papers like places like this is that you get feedback. So we started, you're right, we started with this eclectic group of theories and so on, and throughout the process, we got feedback to say, well, look, you got to focus, you got to be clear about what you're trying to do here. And so, with the help of reviewers and commentators and colleagues like you, we ended up with a new institutional theoretical framework. And let me maybe say briefly about what this means. So, new institutional theoretical framework essentially looks at how organizations learn about practices, or how practices actually spread. So a practice may typically, within a new institutional theoretical framing or broader institutional framing, it must start with a regulatory framework. So there's a law that backs it, and everybody must do this, and then everybody is doing it. Then you might get to a state where others copy. So others may be, although there's no law, but they may just copy and learn. And then there's an educative kind of angle to it. And then the practice becomes normal. So normative framework. So everybody, this is the way we do things. Now, so we look at it from that kind of angle at the beginning by saying that, well, the Office of Student and the Committee of University Chairs passes this kind of regulatory framework and expect higher education institutions, certainly in the UK, to comply or use these framework and start reporting along those lines. We think that others will, even if they're not necessarily, let's say Buckingham, for example, which is a privately funded one. By the way, I think increasingly the UK landscape is changing. There's now Arden University, others are popping up now. I think you will see more private sector activity. Even if they're not required by the law, they may copy, they may learn, oh, this is a good practice. And so there's an educative angle of it. And then it becomes a normative practice. So that's one way of looking at it. But we then move on, so that we don't actually test this kind of three-stage approach: educative, regulatory, regulative, educative, and normative. We don't actually test that. But what we look at it is that we look at it from two angles. That either this is engaging in non-financial reporting, risk management, and disclosure subsequently is really something that is really good to do for the institution, and we are going to do it. It's not necessarily driven by law. So it is just simply efficient to do this. It is the right thing to do. It will help us. It is instrumental motive behind it. In other words, if you manage well, you'll be able to disclose well, and ultimately you manage your risk well. So your sustainable longevity, survival in the longer term is at risk. And those that are able to focus on that will do well. So that's the efficiency angle. And the efficiency angle might come from, if you manage well, you might get resources, you might get support from the Office of Students, from the government, and so on. So you're on the right track to survive. Or you might, so that's one aspect of this new institutional framework that we focus on. It's more argumentative. We argue this normatively. And then you have the alternative to this, which is that this is not good. We don't like it. It's just a waste of our time, but we have to do it. So our heart, it's not in it. We need to do it, because if we don't do it, we are punished or something like this. So we're just going to do it anyhow and show that we are just, it's kind of greenwash in the environmental terms. Just create an impression. So impression management is another term for this. We're going to report nonetheless on risk, but we don't really think this is really a good idea. But obviously, if you don't do it, we will be the odd one out. And so they don't actually mean this, but they're doing it for the impression of it, from the legitimacy of it, and so on. So although it's a near institutional framing, you can see that the logics come from legitimizing and come from the efficiency and so on. So that is the kind of approach that we take. And by taking this approach, it allows us to contribute to literature by explaining particularly why we might see a low disclosure, for example, or you might see a high disclosure, for example. And that is also linked to the quality of governance argument, because we think that if the firm is really well managed, they would take risk management seriously. And so even if it's not required by the law, I mean, that's the right thing to do. What in practice we see in our data is that it's probably a mixture of both predictions, in the sense that sometimes even time element of it, even if you want to do it, you can't do it immediately. It will take time, a year or 2, 3 to have effect. And so it's more, the conjecture is that it's more likely institutions might have a mixed approach, where they may start with probably a symbolic in order to gain legitimacy, but then they will engage more substantively as they go along. And so that is the contribution we are trying to make, in that sense. And apologies, I think it's much clearer in our new versions of the paper.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Collins. I think that's well put together, and it's very clear to me now. I probably have just one final question, if it could be a very short answer because of time. In some of the control variables that you've used, or that you should use or could use, I'm just thinking, I'm thinking gender, obviously, gender, and some other very characteristics, ethnicity of the top management team, or in this case, exec team, the Senate, and even VC, CEO position, things like that. But what I'm quite interested also in is, so if you look at Scottish University versus English University, London University versus university in the north like Newcastle, Sunderland, Durham. And of course, you looked at post-92, pre-92, etc. But did you, thinking a bit more about the institutionalism, because I think some of the things you talked about is about isomorphism and things like that. But looking at maybe some cultural aspect of institutionalism, and then looking at, okay, did you see something quite peculiar with how Northern universities were being run and their approach to risk, for instance, versus typically London universities?
Yeah, I agree with you. We did not look at this, and I raised my hand up. So we did not look at this for a number of reasons. One is that the the actual number of institutions in our sample. So for example, if you take Northern Ireland, there are only 3 of them, right? So only three institutions. Of course, it's representative of the sample. So Northern Ireland has got about 7 or so institutions anyway, or 6 or 5. So it's not big. So from the kind of large scale analysis that we do, I think we can do that for, say, the descriptive analysis that we do, stage 1, question 1. Are there any differences? We can do that. But for the large scale analysis that we do, unfortunately, some of them are like Wales, for example. We've got 9 institutions or so. It's just too tiny to do anything reasonable. Maybe Scotland you can do, because Scotland is different. So that's number 1. The only thing that we do is that we kind of control for country damage. So we have the 3 countries. Now, that is kind of a general level control. It doesn't look for the detail that you're looking for. For example, are there differences in this? Are there differences? I can see that we can do some more work maybe on the descriptive side to see whether these cultural differences, sometimes also the legal framework. Sometimes the legal framework are slightly different, or the requirements are slightly different. The financial imperative is also slightly different. So Scottish institutions, as you know, still funded by the, so if you're a Scottish student, you get a scholarship, you automatically get a scholarship to go, the government pay for you. The government still pay for you. While if you are in England, Wales, or Northern Ireland, in Wales and Northern Ireland, it's means tested. So it depends on your family's income and so on. While in England, you've got to pay. So there are some small differences there, which you can argue might make a difference in this kind of analysis. Probably given the size of these number of higher education institutions in these countries, particularly Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, a large-scale quantitative analysis is not the best for them. It may be a bit more descriptive, perhaps interview-based analysis, in-depth analysis, case studies might help, which, as you may know, we did that I did that a bit of that with Steven and Martin and Co. We kind of visited some of them, and we learned a little bit around that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Collins. We're going to stop now. Thank you very much, Collins, for that very engaging presentation. A lot of thanks to colleagues as well who've joined. I think we ended up being 20. So that's a very good number, given the very short notice for advertising this particular webinar. So if you would kindly complete the satisfaction poll, that would help us. So a big thank you to you once again, Collins, and I do hope to physically welcome you to JCUS in the near future. So thank you, Erica. Thank you, Vinny, for doing all the work behind these. Thank you, everyone, and I'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to coming to visiting you, JCU, one day.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yes.